So what do you know about the Chinese economy? Well, they're communist, right? And everyone is really, really poor and works in sweatshops, right? Well, not exactly. Before 1978, China functioned under a communist economic system. And to better explain how that works, we're going to use the example of a farmer. So, say there's a Chinese farmer and a US farmer, and they both have access to 100 acres of land. With the Chinese system, the Chinese government would own the land, and the farmer would be told what to plant and how much. So, for this example, say our farmer has to plant 75 acres of corn. The farmer still has 25 acres left, but since there is no incentive, he won't get more money for 25 extra acres of corn. He doesn't plant anything on that extra land.
So I grew up in the rural part of China that was before the economic reform, and I grew up in a family of six: my grandparents, my parents, and I have a younger sister. It was under socialism, so the good part was, I was still young. I did not have to work much, but the bad part was we barely had enough to eat.
America has a free market capitalist economy. So, to compare the two systems, we'll use the same example of the farmer. With a capitalist economy system, our American farmer can plant whatever he thinks will bring the most money, and he can plant as much of it as he can afford to. The Chinese farmer was told to grow only corn. But the American farmer planted carrots, broccoli, peppers, and onions because he thought that these crops would bring him the most money.
It's very, very different. So you mean if I go back, almost 40 years, that China was still under Mao, under socialism. And, here we have private ownership of land, and people, the farmers make their own decisions based on their reading of the market, based on their skills. And at the time, in China, basically, we were living in some kind of collective setup, and it was a so-called a commune, and the decision was made at the village level. The leaders at the village level, they have to decide how many acres of rice we would plant, and how many acres of corns we would plant. And after harvest, they will divide the harvest according to each person's contribution, and at the same time considering the family composition, all those things. And I think the main difference was abundance of resource here in comparison to the limited amount of resource available to us. We did not have tractor. For example, my family of six, probably the total amount of acreage was less than 1 acre. So that's the main, I think, contrast.
This type of system governed China from the 1940s until 1978, when Mao Zedong died. Deng Xiaoping took over and made some major changes, one of which was opening up China and expanding industrialization. Industrialization involves the large-scale introduction of manufacturing, advanced technical enterprises, and other productive economic activity into an area. Since the reforms of 1978, a lot of the agricultural workers moved to cities to find jobs in factories, changing the labor demographic dramatically. China's economy has grown at an outstanding rate in the past 40 years, and the percentage of the population living in poverty has dropped from 84.02% in 1980 to 6.26% in 2014. And now China exports goods all over the world. But there have also been some negative side effects to the massive industrialization. Starting in 1978, factories began popping up all over China, and the industrial age began. Because of the amount of new factories springing up and low wages in China, companies from all over the world started moving their factories there, which dramatically increased the standard of living in China and made them an integral piece of the global economy. How so? Well, let's take a shirt, for example. The tag on the inside of your shirt might say "Made in China," but that's not the only place where that shirt was made. The cotton for that shirt might have been grown and harvested in India, and then those raw materials could have been sent to, let's say, Egypt, where the raw cotton was converted into fabric. After that, the fabric finally makes its way to China, where it is turned into a plain cotton t-shirt. But wait, there's more. Now our shirt has to go to the Netherlands, where a design will be screen printed onto the shirt, and then it's shipped back to the US, where the shirt will be sold at a Target, H&M, or Gap somewhere. The US imports more from China than any other country in the world, with China making up 19% of the US's total yearly imports. So we can see that China is an essential piece in the world economy and production cycle. But what are some of the downsides of this expansion?
Well, industrialization creates tons of problems. I think the most visible ones are pollution, environmental damage, and the less visible, but you can feel it, is the inequality. Inequality, in the old days, the bad days, one good side is there was not that much difference, and so you don't envy that much of what other people have, and the people get along better when you are more or less equal.
In 2014, only 8 of the 74 major cities in China that were monitored for air quality met the national standard for clean air. And in 2013, 15.7% of the groundwater was deemed very poor quality, which means it can't be used for drinking water. The industrial areas in particular show a lot of long-term effects in air and water pollution. Some days the air pollution doesn't look that bad, but most days it looks something like this. These high levels of pollution can have negative effects on the health of those living and working in China. The working conditions in some factories are also not so great. Workers in China usually work more hours a day than American factory workers, and they always get paid less. When confronted about human rights and working conditions in China, China's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, said this.
I have to ask whether you understand China. Have you been to China? Do you know that China has lifted more than 600 million people out of poverty? And do you know that China is now the second largest economy in the world from a very low foundation? Do you think development is possible for China without protection of human rights? And do you know that China has written protection and promotion of human rights into our constitution?
So, in the past 40 years, China has skyrocketed to be the second largest economy in the world. The overall standard of living has risen, and nearly 600 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. The big trade-offs have been pollution and poor working conditions. But how did the Chinese people see this?
Certainly it improved vast majority of Chinese people's living situation, but there are also the consequences you have to live with, the inequality, the pollution, and there are also people not, it's getting better, but there's still considerable amount of people living under absolute poverty.
40 years ago, China was on the brink of collapse, and people were starving. So for most people, poor working conditions is a fair trade-off for being able to provide for themselves at this point. We've also shown how the Chinese economy is an active, integral piece of a larger global economy that we have all come to rely on for so many of our manufactured goods. But we are left with many questions. Has this growth been largely positive for Chinese citizens? How has this expansion affected factories and economies in other countries around the world, including the US? And what does this say about the price a country pays for progress?